Welcome to this series of modules on storytelling and science. My name is Jonah Willihnganz. I'm the director of the Stanford Storytelling Project. And in this module, we're going to talk about writing your script. So last time, you finished up by creating what we called a step script, which is a kind of elaborated outline that came from your storyboard. And now what we're going to begin to do is to use that to fill out and build the actual full script. And I want to say right away that often when students get to this stage, they're feeling pretty good because they've told the story, they've done a full storyboard, they have a sense of the scenes, and you've now had these bullet points, enumerated points of your turning points of the story. So you have a good sense of the order and good flow. And sometimes we're tempted to essentially keep it at a kind of outline level, and you think, I'm just going to sit down with the mic, I'm going to let it rip, I'm going to improvise, I can probably talk this out the way I did it initially. Odds are that will be a complete, utter disaster. So this is the moment I'm taking to urge you to create a very tight, specific script and literally put everything that you're going to say on the page. We will then later get to how to deliver that in a way that feels to the audience to be spontaneous, authentic, casual, that doesn't feel scripted, that doesn't feel like you're reading. So in Radiolab, in This American Life, almost everything that they do and say is scripted. It doesn't sound like it is, but it is. You want to think about your piece in a similar way. The basics I want to just cover with you are that your script is going to be about 6 to 8 pages. And the reason that it is going to be so short is that typically speaking, when you double space something, which these will be double spaced pages, it takes about 2 minutes to read a full page of text. So this right away would create something on the order of 12 to 16 minutes. Now sometimes you may incorporate a lot of dialogue, and so reading that page may take a lot less time. Then the last basic element to keep in mind is that when you are creating your script, you're going to do what we said at the end of the last module. And then you're going to have a step 2. So under step 1, you're going to take that sentence that you wrote and you're going to put it in bold, and then you're going to write your entire scene, word for word. The dramatization, the actual scene, and then the tell. So remember we talked about the show and the tell. You're going to write that whole thing underneath that heading. And then you're going to do the same thing all the way through. And then at the very end, you're just going to erase your headings, and that gives you your script. Okay? So with this in mind, now I'm going to talk to you about 10 elements that you want to keep in mind as you are writing your script. So the first thing that we haven't talked about is to create a promise. At the beginning of your piece, you want to tell them either implicitly or explicitly that there's a reason that they're going to want to listen. So sometimes this could be something very explicit like scientists did not know something at a certain point, but by the end of this era or whatever, they had completely solved this problem in an unexpected way. Sometimes you can do this implicitly. You don't need to actually say that they're going to hear something unexpected or surprising or unusual. You can describe how the beginning of the 1850s, people thought this way, but by the end of the 1930s, the worldview had completely changed. And that's it. So I haven't made a promise there, but I've implicitly cued you that you're going to get the story of a major change about how people think about, for example, evolution. Second thing is you want to indicate to your audience why this is important, what's significant. We call this the stakes step. By the 1930s, we understood that we evolved. This not only affected the way we thought about humans, but it affected political policies, economic policies around welfare and all that kind of thing. Then we know right away that the story we're about to hear has impact, and that knowing that story is going to help us understand something that means something to the audience. These two things are incredibly important, and if your script lacks them, you're going to hear about it Okay. Third, common ground. Often it's very good for us to begin with common ground. And we have an example of this in the Alter G piece, which opens with a scene, a hypothetical scene of waking to an alarm. It puts us in the position of a subject that we can identify with. So these three are usually all things that come at the beginning of your scripts. So these are things to keep in mind in the opening. Now we get to more the whole body of your story. You want to keep in mind, last time we talked about having everything in a chronology. We might consider flashbacks or that kind of thing, but in general you want to start with the inciting incident, get to the climax. Now that you have that mapped out, you may decide that there is some element or some moment that you want to foreshadow. So I might tell you something that happens at the end of the story to emphasize the stakes or the promise, and I might even describe it a little bit. And then I might ask a question like, how could a scientific discovery create such a consequence or an effect for so many people so quickly? And then I would begin the story. So that's where you want to think, is there a moment late in your story that is out of chronology that you could foreshadow and maybe describe a little bit at the beginning? Fifth, conflict. So we've talked about how plot is essentially a character dealing with a challenge or a problem. What that means is that the character, the lead character or group of characters is always in conflict in some way. It can be in conflict with the natural world, or it can be in conflict with an ideology, a way of thinking that is embodied or assumed that they need to break out of in order to have their discovery, for example. There's going to be an overarching conflict, a challenge that then is solved with the climax. But you want to think about how in every scene does it begin with a challenge that is addressed. It doesn't mean that it is overcome, but the character is trying to face it. They're struggling with something. The reason why this is so important is that if we don't have a sense of a character struggling with something, most narratives slow down, sometimes to a dead stop. We've talked about this one quite a bit, so I won't spend much time. What I want to add to what we've talked about in terms of the importance of concrete and sensate detail is a way to check for this. You can just simply think about, in the scene, are you using a lot of sensate details? Think of the 5 senses: taste, smell, hearing, sight, and touch. One cautionary note, it's tempting to get a little crazy and really use lots and lots of details about a single event or a single action. Try to avoid that. Usually in radio we try to stick to 2. So you might have, for example, what something looks like and what it smells like. Number 7 to keep in mind is to use examples and illustrations for concepts. So many of you are going to be working with something that is a discovery or a device or something that actually is relatively complex, or a process that is relatively complex. No matter what amount of complexity you give them, usually it's good to start or end on an analogy so that whether or not they follow the complexity, they're able to hang on to an image of some kind. 8th, signposting and repetition. One of the things that we don't typically do, especially in short pieces of writing, is repeat ourselves, and our teachers would tell us not to repeat ourselves. You might repeat your thesis at the end, but that's about it. It may feel a little repetitive, but you actually want to signpost where we are pretty regularly, often every other scene. 9th, voiced information. Something like, this experiment really didn't work. And when I say it that way, my voice is actually transmitting to you the information that not only that it really didn't work, but that the feeling around it was chagrin or shame. Hear yourself, because when you hear yourself and what the tone can do, often you can compress the amount of narration that you're creating. And lastly, I'm closing on surprise, because surprise is maybe the most important element in a great story. So as you're writing your script, you want to keep in mind not to give away the climax. You might want to foreshadow it a little bit. You're going to build to it, but what you want to do is position it as a surprise. Something very unexpected, even the opposite of what was expected, occurs. This may not be available to you depending on what your research and what the discovery is or what the device is. But you want to try to keep in mind that you're working up to something, so don't give it away. So those are our 10 elements to consider as you're writing your script. All right, so we've talked about the basics and moving from the step script to the full script. We've talked about 10 elements that you want to consider as you're writing. And now we're going to just look briefly at the questions for feedback. So once you have your script and you exchange it with your partners and you give feedback, each partner is going to look at 4 questions, and these will be available on a handout, but I want to just run through them very quickly. First, you want to look at your partner's script and ask, where was I hooked? Or was I hooked? Did I feel like I wanted to keep going? Could the hook be improved in some way? Is there something else in the story or something else you know about this research that could increase the promise or the stakes of the piece? Second, dramatization and plot. Is there rising action? So remember that curve that we have that goes like this, and all of the scenes. Do you have a sense of forward momentum where things, the main character is proceeding through a series of actions that are getting them closer and closer to the climax? So look at your partner's script and let them know where you think that forward momentum could be increased. Second part of this is it vivid? This is about the concrete sensate details. Are the scenes sufficiently vivid? Do you see them? Do you hear them? Do you know, do you believe that this actually happened? Third, reflection and analysis. Usually most of you are working with a discovery of some kind. So is the discovery's significance clear? By the time we get to the end of the piece, do we feel like we understand the struggle that occurred, the process that got us to the climax, and do we understand why this discovery matters? As you look at the script, let your partner know where could that significance be increased. Often it's at the beginning or the end, so by amplifying the problem or amplifying the impact. And fourth, where are there confusions or questions that you have? And here the most important part is really identify in the script where exactly is this occurring. So as you'll find, if a partner says to you, well, the whole middle part of the piece was a little bit slow and confusing, I think you should fix that. That isn't really helpful because now you're looking at the whole maybe 4 or 5 pages of stuff trying to figure out what it was that was either slow or confusing. So really help each other by focusing specifically where exactly, what lines in the script did it feel as though you didn't understand the transition that just occurred, you don't understand why the next scene happened, you don't know who's speaking, any kind of questions like that, be as specific as possible. There are some typical structures the authors use to organize their material. First, you have the structure of exploration discovery. So usually in this structure what happens is you have a group of people in some way investigating a question or trying to figure out something, and it's a very long, usually not detailed exploration, and then they have a surprising discovery, something that was unexpected, that leads them down the road to a larger discovery. So one of the pieces that we're recommending that you listen to in this module is the yellow stuff in Radiolab, and this is a good example of this. The second one is what we call the peeling the onion structure. This is the most typical, most used structure in almost any genre. And what this is that you have a problem of some kind and you have a progression of solutions that you're trying. And often in that progression you get closer and closer and closer. So it's like peeling an onion. The first layer gets you a little bit of distance, you know maybe what doesn't work, you can rule out some things. The next layer gets you closer to the goal, the third layer more, fourth, and so on, until you get to the core and you get the actual answer. A third typical structure is what we call the expectation truth structure. So what happens here is we begin with what everybody tends to think about something, assumptions that people have about the way the body processes sugar. We typically think of the body processing sugar in this way, and that creates a bunch of things that people do. It creates treatment regimens, it creates all kinds of approaches. So everybody is thinking one thing, but it doesn't fit in a lot of situations until that friction becomes strong enough to create a breakthrough. So that's the expectations, truth structure. The final typical structure is what we call a thesis exemplification. And what this is essentially you begin with a discovery or some big change in how, for example, the body would metabolize a substance. And then what you do is you describe lots of different applications. So you give lots of examples. So you begin with the thesis, a discovery, a thing, a claim, and then here are all the different ways that it has been now applied. Usually those are arranged in increasing amounts of dramatic impact. So you begin with the application that is the least dramatic. It's significant in some way, and then you end on the application that is the most dramatic. That's what gives this piece the narrative arc, because the arc is not existing within the discovery itself, but in the application. So those are 4 typical structures that you can use if you're struggling to think about how to frame your piece. Apply one of these 4, and now I have to go, but apply one of those 4 and you'll probably be on your way. All right, see you next time.